Let me get one more guy in. There we go. Hello. Welcome everybody to this regularly occurring seminar series as part of the Georgetown Wargaming Society. With me today is Professor Jorrit Winches, a man who I know in a somewhat professional capacity. He and I have met before, and so I was excited to get to host his talk, as I know him, I would say, somewhat well from our time in Peru together. Jorrit is a professor at the University of Würzburg. He's a history professor with a specialty kind of in the ancient world and also in conflict simulation. And he has a passion that is evident when you talk to him for the Prussian Kriegsspiel and the history of that game and the evolution of it. And so as to not do further kind of disrespect to the professor's work here, I will now let him describe his own oeuvre as he best sees fit. Jorrit, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And I'm slightly nonplussed because you basically already said all that's interesting about me, which is not a lot. As Walter said, I'm an ancient historian by training originally, and I have sort of ventured into the big world of serious games and war games, of educational serious games and war games, through teaching originally, and then at one point started to explore the history of that, and this eventually led me down this rabbit hole that the Prussian Kriegsspiel is, and this is one of the points that I'm going to make in the next couple of minutes. It is, at least I think so, more than only a rabbit hole, because I think that there is still some relevance to what the Prussians originally did with the Kriegspiel and what we can do nowadays with it. So I have some slides prepared. I'll basically give something like a sort of talk on the history and the, at least in my opinion, continued relevance of the Kriegspiel. But if there are any questions, just feel free to ask. This is not meant to be a full-blown frontal lecture. Rather, I'll stumble through these slides and give you my sort of ideas about them. So let's face the first challenge, and that is sharing the screen with you. So hopefully you can all see now this presentation of mine. And hopefully you can actually see the full screen and not the screen with the preview of the next slide. Walter, could you indicate whether that's the case?
Yes, I can see the full screen.
And not the
see kind of your preview of it, as Jan has said as well.
You see the preview, okay? So then I have.
But I do see the next slide as well.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
So apologies for that. I'm an ancient historian, and as such, I'm clearly only barely capable of interacting with modern technology.
We've cracked it. This is it.
Yeah, great.
This is it. And I wish I had that excuse to use when I'm very envious.
Great. So let's talk about the Kriegspiel. And the very first thing that I want to give you is a very brief overview over what I'm going to say. I'll say a little bit about the history of the Kriegspiel from its introduction to the Prussian army in 1824 to about the 1870s. And then in and around 1870, things change. And we'll talk a little bit about the changes. This is really the period when the Kriegspiel turns into a wider ranging activity that we'd call wargaming. And then the third part would be really the question is, what is it all good for in the 21st century? I mean, we must never forget, in 1824, that is basically the tail end of the Napoleonic period. So if you're an infantryman in 1824, your main weapon system is a smoothbore musket with a effective range of something this side of 50 yards, whereas 50 years later, in 1870, things have totally changed, obviously, and nowadays the infantry combat is totally different. So the question really is justified whether something that was introduced in 1824 can still be of any use to us today, and that would be the third part. And there will be a fourth part, which is not on the slide. Well, just very briefly show you it's sort of the commercial at the end, very briefly show you what we do here in Würzburg when it comes to Kriegspiel. So, talking about the history of the Kriegspiel, the idea of depicting combat or depicting military activity by means of a board game, that idea is an old one. We can already find it with the Greeks and Romans, and by the 18th century, in German-speaking Central Europe, the Kriegsspiele had been invented by quite a number of people. This slide is just to show you a couple of names, and every year basically stands, or every name stands for one specific invention of a Kriegspiel. And all these games had a couple of things in common. One was that they were, nearly all of them were basically developed from chess. So you had an inverted commas map, a gridded map, basically just squares, green squares for, pastures, dark green squares for forests, blue squares for rivers and stuff like that. But it was basically the checkerboard pattern increased to, let's say, 30 by 30 or 40 by 40 squares. The second important thing is all these rule sets had, or the rule sets for all these games were in the sort of 100-page plus region. So these were complicated war games. Inventors were trying to adapt the rules for chess in order to give some semblance of actual sort of, military operations. But it was all very complicated, and this leads me to the third thing that they all had in common. At the time, military men were actually looking at these and saying, yeah, they are quite nice for sort of, intellectual recreation, but they have nothing to do whatsoever with actual military activities. These are unsuitable for actually training military decision makers. And this is really the point where we are in 1824. And when this gets introduced in 1824 in the Prussian army, it's important to bear in mind that up to that point, Kriegspiele had been something that was realized by the professional community, by professional soldiers, as something very distant from the reality of making military decisions. And that's important because the history behind that and how it actually becomes adopted by the Prussian army is quite funny, and it's too good not to be explored in some detail. Forgive me for going down that hole. But what happens is the following. In 1824, the inventor of this new Prussian Kriegsspiel, Baron von Reiswitz, he is a young lieutenant in the Guards Artillery Brigade. And instead of engaging in the usual free time activity that young officers do, and that's an activity that is based on any combination of booze, women, cards, and horse riding, instead of doing this, Reiswitz and a couple of his buddies, they basically lock themselves up in rooms in their barracks and play this game. And this is something that makes them suspicious to their superiors for two reasons. One, well, you have any group of young men locking them up behind closed doors, doing things, and obviously people start to think about, let's say, indecent things that are done there. But the other problem is in the 1820s and in the 1830s, the Prussian army actually has an issue with secret societies. There are several cases in Prussian garrisons where both officers and common soldiers form secret societies, and these secret societies are seen as very dangerous because they talk about really evil things like, democracy and constitution and all these things that no one in the Prussian army must think about. So the divisional commander, hearing that his young lieutenants engage in suspicious activity, well, he calls them up and asks them, what are you going to do? What are you doing in behind these closed doors? And von Reiswitz says, well, I've invented this Kriegspiel, and this is what we do. We play the Kriegspiel. And this is the first point in Kriegspiel history where there is really a sort of, you could call it luck or chance or something like that. Fate intervenes. because his divisional commander is not a grizzled 55-year-old veteran of countless battles in the Napoleonic period, who just has no interest at all into Kriegsspiele, but his divisional commander is one of the royal princes, the younger one, actually, the later King William I. And he's just in his late 20s and easily impressionable, and he's enthusiastic about it. He wants to learn. What are you doing? Show me, is what he says. And so what they have to do is they have to prepare a presentational game. Okay, fair enough. Now the problem about all this is the chap on the right-hand side on this slide, because this is Karl von Müffling, at the time chief of the Prussian General Staff, the highest ranking general officer in the Prussian army. He is very much senior leadership in the Prussian army. And what Reiswitz doesn't know is that his divisional commander, the royal prince, he goes to Müffling and says, one of my young lieutenants has this brilliant idea, and I want you to have a look at it. Now, just for a brief moment, try to put yourself into the shoes of Karl von Müffling. He knows what a Kriegsspiel is, because everybody knows what a Kriegsspiel is. It's this useless thing that is derived from chess. And Karl von Müffling he's in charge of the Prussian army. He is very much senior leadership. So his time is extremely precious. And he cannot say to his divisional commander, well, get lost, because he is the royal prince. You can't say get lost to the son of the boss, you know, that's not going to work. So yeah, while he attends this presentational game, and he actually brings two other generals with him. And I think it is fair to assume that on his way to this presentational game, he was actually thinking in very colorful detail about ways to ruin the career of young Lieutenant von Reiswitz. You know, the equivalent of, in American terms, of relocating him to some forlorn base in Alaska or something like that. And we actually have a description of this presentational game by one of the friends of Reiswitz, and he says the atmosphere in the room, the mood was icy, because Müffling and his fellow generals made it very obvious that this was a waste of time. An hour into this game, Müffling jumps up from the table and exclaims, "This is not a game. It's a school for war, and it has to be in every regiment." 6 weeks later, there is a royal edict saying that the Kriegspiel has to be acquired by the army, one set for every regiment. And in autumn 1824, the regiments begin with Kriegspiele. So the question really is, how comes that Kriegspiel is actually so successful? Because how comes that Müffling actually totally changes his mind? It's really a 180-degree turn. Now, the reason for that, there are three reasons. One, and you can see already on the left-hand side of the slide, Müffling was probably the single most suitable person for interacting with the Kriegspiel in the Prussian army at that point. Because the very first thing that is fundamentally different from the Kriegspiel as opposed to all these other games is the Kriegspiel uses topographical maps, highly detailed topographical maps. And that was something fairly new at the time. Indeed, it is Müffling who introduces topography to the Prussian army. He is in charge of the very first topographical survey in Prussia. He partly produces the very first topographical atlas in the Prussian army. And, well, comes the Kriegspiel, and basically the situation is he enters the room, and he probably already thought, when he saw Reiswitz actually unpacking a large topographical map, something that was, and this is just a sample from an 1867 map, something that at the time was really very new technology, and something that you actually had to teach officers to use. We must never forget, in 1824, there is a fair amount of officers who have no experience with using topographical maps. And so that already is an important thing that is actually in favor of the Kriegspiel. Second important difference, the older Kriegspiele used tokens representing basically blobs of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. So you have a piece, and this piece is, say, 1,000 men or 5,000 men or something like that. Kriegspiel is different. It uses tokens, and these tokens represent actual units, so a battalion, half a battalion, a company, something like that. But what's more important is the tokens have the same scale as the map, at least the same width as scaled to the scale of the map. What does that mean? Now, again, let's look at an example. What you can see here is an infantry brigade composed of several battalions, and you can see that these tokens, they are fairly small. And you can see there are 3 tokens with a strange sort of circular pattern on them. That's a battery. And this battery is occupying the top of a small hill. And you couldn't put more tokens on that hill. And this is exactly what the opportunity provided here is. If you actually want to know how many batteries can I put on that hill, well, you take these tokens, put them on the hill, and then you can see, okay, only 1 battery actually fits on the hill. Having the tokens in the same scale as the map allows you to teach participants the problem of moving forces through space, which is great, particularly if you are in an army that never actually goes out onto maneuver. So the third important thing is the rules. I told you that all these difficult Kriegsspiele of the 18th and very early 19th century, they have these 100, 150, 200-page thick rule sets that you have to learn in order to actually be able to play. And indeed, as in many board games and war games, proficiency in the rules is directly dependent on success. So the more proficient you are in the rules, the better you are in the war game, and the more likely you are to succeed. The Prussian Kriegspiel is radically different because the rules are basically an aid for the facilitators, but the participants have nothing to do with that whatsoever. So the participants just do their decision-making. They go through their decision-making process. They basically tell the facilitators what they want to do with their forces, and the facilitators then using the rules as an aid, decide what actually happens and report back to the participants, which means that you have an extremely high accessibility. You can just basically start the war game now. The only ones who actually have to know the rules are the facilitators. Now, this obviously also means that when you update the rules, you can use this in the 1820s, but you can also use it in the 1830s, in the 1840s, and so on and so forth. And this is what happens. If we look at the history of the Kriegspiel, we can see that these rules get updated. And it's interesting to see that they are, there's this initial sort of creation of the Kriegspiel. It's the 1824 rule set, and then supplement in 1828 that they introduce. Then we have in the 1840s, when they introduce new weapon systems, they update the rules. And then you can see that in the 1860s, 1870s, where you have a very short sequence of new technological inventions, they continuously update their rule sets. We have, in Würzburg, tried to plot that against the introduction of new weaponry. And you can see that particularly the 1860s and 1870s, with the introduction of new artillery pieces and then the introduction of new infantry rifles, is also a period where there is a intense publication activity. Now, going to the question of what it was actually used for, it's very interesting to see that the actual title of the very first rule set, and there's still the title in 1848 and in 1855, only changes in the 1860s, but the original title is not Anleitung zum Kriegspiel, which would translate into basically rules for the Kriegspiel or something similar, but it's rather it's the rules for depicting a military maneuver with the map and the tokens of the Kriegspiel. So maneuver is the core term here, and the reason for that is very simple. These are Napoleonic reenactors from Saxonia. So these chaps, once a year, they pull their gun out of probably a garage, fire a few blanks, and have a nice day. They actually get more experience in firing their guns than Prussian artillerymen did in the 1820s and 1830s. The Prussian army in the 1820s, 30s, and early 40s is extremely run down. It's third class at best. They never go into maneuver. In fact, one of the most important theoreticians of that army, Karl von Decker, in 1838 says, in 8 years as a battery commander, I have fired not a single round. I never once took my guns out of the arsenal into the field, because that's expensive stuff, then can break and you have to replace it, and that is expensive, and we do not have the money to do that. Now, in the 1820s, everybody still can remember how it was at Waterloo, and but in the 1830s and 1840s, you have a young generation of officers in that army without any active experience of anything. They don't even have experience of actually taking their troops out on a maneuver. Large-scale maneuvering only starts in the 1840s in Prussia. So between 1824 and, let's say, the late 1840s, the Kriegspiel is mainly used actually as a maneuver simulator. I don't know how to actually take my battery out into the field, but I can at least find out where I could put my battery on a battlefield when I have a map by using the Kriegspiel. It is a poor substitute for a maneuver, no doubt about that, but it is at least a substitute. Now, by the 1850s, things change in the Prussian army, and perhaps the most important figure associated with that change is Moltke, who incidentally is an ardent Kriegsspieler. And it is at that time, and most probably due to his input, that the Kriegspiel expands in purpose to a decision-making simulator. So it's still used for training, if you want, the technical basics, but it's now also used for letting participants face the problems of processing information and making decisions based on processed information, and on facing this fabulous, infamous thing that war has, that's called friction. And by the 1860s, and that would be sort of the fully developed Kriegspiel, and this is one example. Wilhelm von Chischitz is one of the most proficient wargame designers at the time, and his Kriegspiel Anleitung, that is what the Prussians use before, during, and after the War of 1866. This is used both for really tactical training and for training decision makers in facing the fog of war. It looks basically like that. The map that you can see here is an 1867 map, and this is from a very recent war game that we ran at the Planungsamt, at the Bundeswehrplanungsamt in Berlin just a week ago. And the map is from 1867, a map of the Königgrätz battlefield. And this is forces operating there. This is the facilitator map, and in different rooms you have participants with their own maps trying to basically piece together what actually happens, and usually failing to do so. By the 1870s, the Prussians start to develop theory, if you want wargaming theory. And the most important figure here is Jakob Clemens Meckel, who is incidentally also one of the founding fathers of the Japanese army. And he develops a theory of the Kriegspiel, and the first important thing is what is actually good for. And he actually has 7 important points, but the most important 3 are: the Kriegspiel is a depiction of combat. Now that is pretty self-evident. It's an exercise in the art of giving orders, which simply means that you learn how to actually properly give orders. And then, and this is a translation of slightly stilted 19th century German, so bear with me, it's an exercise in subordination and in understanding the intentions of the superior. That is actually very important. That doesn't mean that you have to turn into a sort of robot or something like that. Rather, what Meckel means is the Kriegspiel is an instrument that teaches the participants not only to understand how to execute an order, but also to understand what your superior in the chain of command actually wants you to achieve with that order. So I get an order, move from A to B, and I also have to understand what is actually that I have to achieve at B. What's the intention of that? What's the overall purpose? And only if I understand that, then I can make sort of adjustments on my own. Perhaps I cannot go from A to B directly, but I only have to work my way around C in order to get to B. And yeah, and then you are at a point when somewhere in the distance this fabled mission tactics lurk, because essentially that is only if I can understand what's the overall intention of my of the sort of next in the chain of command. Only if I understand the attention of my chain of command, only then I can actually act on my own trying to achieve that. Meckel also, and that's the second and last quotation of stilted 19th century stuff. Meckel wrote that nothing is as difficult as giving orders, nothing as important as properly editing them. If an order can be misunderstood, it is to be expected that it will be misunderstood. And imprecise orders will always be executed imprecisely. Long orders kill the initiative. Orders that are too detailed stifle the spirit of the subordinate. Every error in an order will always waste the strength and sometimes even the blood of the troops it is issued to. And while this is perhaps 19th century in the way it's put, there is actually, I would say, this very much applies to giving orders nowadays, to making decisions nowadays, as it did in the 19th century. Now, with these thinkings about what is Kriegspiel actually good for, we enter the period where the Kriegspiel actually changes its character and becomes a war game. Any questions up to that point?
We did have a question in the chat, actually, from
Yeah.
Michael Dunn. If you would check there. He's asking how the American Civil War informed, I'm going to mispronounce this man's name, Situich's 1860s Kriegspiel rules.
Yeah, okay, that's a very good question. Sorry, I can't in my present setup I can't see the chat. So if you
okay.
If you could just read it out when it comes, that would be great.
Of course, I will. When you ask for questions, I'll read out questions from the chat.
So that is a very good question. The American Civil War is something that in Europe, the Prussians, as well as others, take a closer look at. And it does not feature in the Kriegspiel at all. There are several reasons for that. One is, it is very interesting to see that the Prussians see this as an exclusively sort of Prussian thing. So there is no discussion of how to depict other armies or other militaries with the means of the Kriegspiel. So the idea of creating a red team that actually tries to, think like, for example, the French, that has French equipment or something like that, this never enters the Kriegspiel. It's always the Prussian army fighting the Prussian army, if you want. The idea of trying to establish French orders of battle, for example, and to replicate French technological capabilities by means of the Kriegspiel never enters the equation, which is very interesting, but that's the fact. And it is slightly different when it comes to actual thinking about, tactics and operations. The Prussians, as do other European military powers, look at the American Civil War and find a couple of things interesting when it comes to infantry, particularly when it comes to the effectiveness of rifled infantry weapons. Other things like, for example, the use of cavalry, they find appalling. So as a whole, it is discussed in the Prussian army, but it does not enter the Kriegspiel really. And it's very interesting to see that it would be interesting whether they actually try to look at battles from the American Civil War by means of the Kriegspiel, but I haven't found evidence for that as yet. There is one big elephant in the room, sort of to be fully open, and that is I'm talking mostly about the official use of the Kriegspiel. by the 1870s, already beginning in the late 1820s, there are also Kriegspiel clubs, that is basically social clubs established by officers playing the Kriegspiel in their spare time off duty. Now, what they do, we have at present no idea, because it is very difficult to find any actual hard evidence for what they did. It's easier to do this once the British take up this activity in the 1880s, because the volunteer gets introduced into the volunteer movement, and then you have actual newspapers reporting about these things. We do not have that in Prussia in the 1820s to 1860s or even beyond. So we do not at present know what these wargaming clubs did. However, given the way the Prussian army works with this large number of reservists, this is actually, or would be, important, because many officers in the Prussian army probably get at least as much exposure to the Kriegspiel by attending these Kriegspiel club meetings as they do through their regular training. But as I said, at present, we simply do not know what they did there. So it may well be that they looked at the American Civil War.
Another question, and I'm going to ask people to hold off on questions until we have the next opportunity. So this will be the last question for now. We have from John: would a Kriegspiel at this time period ever be integrated with something like a staff ride, or is that something that happens today in certain staff rides?
Yeah. So this is really something that begins probably in the okay, I would have to look up when the staff rides actually probably begin, but they begin with Moltke. So you already have it in the 1860s, and this is when the sort of the trend begins to cut down on the actual game. So you have a staff ride, you look at a battlefield, for example, and then you hand out the initial the initial scenario, and then the two parties have to write up their basic the starting orders, and then you leave it at that. This is something that is done fairly often, particularly during staff rides, and sometimes they actually do a full war game. And I think it begins in the 1860s, perhaps even the 1850s, but by the 1870s, it is fully established. So they already do that. Okay, so let's proceed to the second part, which is really now the Kriegspiel branches out. It's about to become basically what we now understand as wargaming. As you all know, wargamers are very, very nice fellows until you ask the one question that no one wants to ask and no one wants to answer: what's the definition of wargame? Because then we all turn into homicidal maniacs. Hopefully not. But the thing is, up to the 1870s, defining what the Kriegspiel is fairly easy. It's a tactical exercise. It's also used for training people in decision making, but it's fundamentally something that is for the army, and it is pretty kinetic in nature. So there is not a lot of logistics behind that, and it's mostly used for training. What now happens is that the Kriegspiel branches out on two different levels. So on one level, we have the element of analysis that then comes as an additional purpose to using the Kriegspiel. So the idea of using the Kriegspiel to actually analyze a war plan for its viability is something that develops in the mid to late 1870s. And obviously, I mean, just as a footnote, there are inherent dangers to that. And an instrument that may excel at actual tactical training may not be exactly well suited to analyzing a war plan, because when it comes to analyze a war plan, it's important to know what the other side is going to do. And as I said, thinking about what the other side is going to do was never really a prominent thing in the Prussian Kriegspiel. The other thing is, different kinds of Kriegsspiele develop or come into being. We have the Festungskriegspiel. That is a specific set of Kriegspiel rules and of tokens and of maps dealing with fortress warfare. Logistics in the shape of basic logistics, that would be the logistische Kriegsspiel, of casualty management, that is the Sanitätskriegspiel, or of railway logistics, which would be the Eisenbahnkriegspiel. Now, these are, and that's important to bear in mind, these are not Kriegsspiele in the sense of the sort of traditional Kriegsspiel where you actually move counters on maps. These are rather sort of staff exercises, if you want, that are adjudicated. So it's the basic setup, but you do not have specific rules for moving tokens. Rather, this is done basically by the facilitating teams. And from 1876 onwards, you have the Seekriegspiel, which is, again, interesting because it's basically combines two levels of wargame, a tactical wargame with specific rules for actually moving blocks of wood or even miniature ships across the table, and a larger operational level that basically takes, for example, the North Sea as a theater. And then I don't have a slide on that. There is a third sort of branching out. This is actually an invention by Meckel, the chap I already showed you. We have the distinction now between the tactical Kriegsspiel, which is basically everything up to 2 army corps battling it out against each other. Then we have the operational Kriegsspiel, which would be basically the operational level that we now understand as the operational level. And then there is something that the Prussians call the strategic Kriegsspiel, which we would nowadays probably call the grand operational or something like that. So it's a campaign. It's not strategic as we understand it, sort of the whole war or the whole nation, but rather it's a, let's say, the campaign in Bohemia in 1866 as one big Kriegsspiel. That would be a strategic level Kriegsspiel for the Prussians. I'll just give you one example that is pretty famous for these developments, and that is the Seekriegspiel Südreise, which is a strategic level, or rather in the Prussian sense, or a grand operational level war game that was run in winter 1912-1913 and again in winter 1913-1914, and it was an analytical war game. The German East Asia Squadron, commanded by Admiral von Spee, whom you can see on the left hand of the slide, they had a war plan that was designed by the Admiralty, what they should do in case of war against England and France in East Asia. And during these 2 war games, this war plan was tested by von Spee, and he then decided that the war plan was basically impossible to actually put into practice. And he wrote to the Admiralty early in 1914 with the results of these 2 Kriegsspiele, saying, well, we cannot execute this war plan. That is basically impossible. It was mainly due to the logistics involved. So we have to do something different. And what Spee then does in 1914, when the war breaks out, is basically the result of the analysis of this war plan. This is one of the few examples where you can actually connect the analysis of war plan, a negative analysis, with actual events then in the war. There is one final sort of branching out of the Kriegsspiel, and that is that after 1871, all of a sudden, basically the Prussian way of war becomes pretty popular. Until 1870, France was Europe's premier land force, if you want. So the French army was seen as the most important army in France. Everybody dressed like the French did, and everybody looked to the French for inspiration. In 1870, many observers expected France to be successful in this war of 1870-71. Many expected French forces to be in Berlin within 6 weeks. Well, after 6 weeks, Battle of Sedan happened. That's basically 6 weeks into the war. And the Battle of Sedan ended with the total destruction of this army and with the fall of the Second Empire. The war then went on for several months, but the thing is, this was an event that really shocked observers in Europe. And all of a sudden they realized, well, the Prussians probably do 1 or 2 things right, and we want to copy that. And now you have a sort of wave of classification that really sweeps through the armies of the industrialized world and ranges from obvious things like introducing permanent staffs, for example, to slightly wonky things like spiked helmet becoming very popular throughout Europe. So if you wonder why the Swiss Guard of the Pope actually turns to spiked helmets after 1871, it is because spiked helmets are hugely popular after 1871 because the Prussians used them. So there is a great sort of affectation for all things Prussian when it comes to the military, and this results in the Kriegspiel, or in wargaming, being introduced basically within about a decade in nearly all modern armies in the world. And from then onwards, you have a nearly continuous tradition of wargaming, at least in the Anglophone world. British wargaming begins in 1872. The USA begins wargaming in 1883. The Naval Staff College begins wargaming in 1887. And from then on, it's basically, let's say, history. Just to illustrate this with one slide, what you can see here on the right-hand side is the very first set of British rules for war games published in 1872. That is just a translation of a Prussian set of rules, slightly adapted to the specifics of the British Army. And on the left-hand side, this is something that I'm always, when I'm giving this talk to mid and higher level military professionals, always shocking them with the slip of paper on the left-hand side. That is the full scenario for a brigade-sized maneuver, or rather for a brigade-sized wargaming, a wargame in 1899 of the British Army. So it's an original piece of original source, original document, and the initial order that then sort of resulted from this scenario, also for the full brigade, was just one A4-sized piece of paper, which is kind of funny. Anyway, one other thing, because it's becomes important later on in my commercial bit. And that's a story that is too good not to tell. So the British Army wants to take up wargaming. And it's important to understand that in the sort of 1850s, 60s, 70s, wargames are not classified. So if you want to take up wargaming as an activity, you just go to your high street bookseller and buy the set of rules. And if you want to buy a map, maps are very expensive, but your bookseller of choice is happy to provide the map, and he will also get the tokens for you. So this is all easily available. So what the British do is, in 1872, they send their military attaché to a high street bookseller in Berlin, and he buys a set of, he buys a map, he buys a set of tokens, sends this back to Aldershot. And in Aldershot, they open the box, and so I should explain that in this box, there is a blue set of tokens, because the Prussians have these dark bluish uniforms. And then there is, just as we do it nowadays, there are red tokens for, displaying the enemy. The British opened the box in Aldershot. Hey, there are red tokens. I mean, who is more red than we are? We are the redcoats. So if you look at the first scenarios they actually wargame, we have the evidence for that. It's always a red army that is defending Britain against an invading blue army. So if you want a freebie who might be behind this blue army, someone who is renowned for blue coats, yeah, just look on the other side of the channel. It's really very funny to see that instinctively the British actually identify with the red tokens in this box of wargaming tokens. Anyway, so that is basically the history of the Kriegspiel, and that is what happens between sort of 1870 and the late 1880s. From then onwards, we have continuous wargaming activity in the Anglophone world. We have continuous wargaming activity outside Prussia or outside Germany elsewhere. And in Germany, we can follow this wargaming activity right down to the First World War and to the end of the First World War. There is no gap between 1919 and then the Army of the Weimar Republic and the Wehrmacht. The sort of wargaming tradition really only comes to an end in 1945. And then there is in 1956, when the Bundeswehr comes into being, They take up some of this activity, but now it is actually much influenced by, if you want, mostly American practices, and bears not a lot of resemblance to what was done actually before 1945 and particularly before 1919. One interesting footnote, and that would be the end to the second section. The term Kriegspiel is, by the time of the First World War, applied to quite a large number of fairly different things. So Kriegspiele are the traditional Kriegspiel, moving tokens on a map in different rooms and doing this thing. Kriegspiel can also be a basically paper exercise. So you get the scenario and then you write the initial orders, and that's it. That would also be a Kriegspiel. This is heavily used in staff courses, for example, where the participants have to do several of these writing exercises. Kriegspiel can also be a term applied to an actual maneuver, taking forces out into the field. And Kriegspiel, and that is really quite funny, is also applied to a mixture of various of these things. So the very first war game run by the fledgling German Air Force, if you want, or rather by its predecessor, by the Air Forces of the German Army in the First World War. They, in 1916, run a operational, basically an operational leadership course, if you want. The very first, that's the sort of, try to establish a leadership course for Air Force leaders on an operational level. And this course, the whole course, is called Kriegspiel. Within the course, you have several writing assignments that are called Kriegspiel, and they have a sort of, if you want, traditional Kriegspiel at the very end. So the participants of this Kriegspiel, the whole course, have to do quite a number of different Kriegspiele, the writing assignments, in order to qualify for the final Kriegspiel, which is actually a war game on a table with tokens. So there is a sort of the terminology gets slightly fuzzy. Any questions up to that point? Because now we will leave history and go into the present sort of.
Yes, so there are a couple of questions in the chat which has been popping off. I'm going to give you 3, and we will save the rest of the questions for the next juncture. Would Kriegspiel have succeeded without someone championing it, is what Colin is asking.
That is, I think, a very important point. And of course, we have no way to be certain, but my personal belief is that it would not. I think that the introduction in 1824 is due to Müffling being fascinated by it and realizing the potential. Had Müffling said, yeah, well, it's quite nice, but who cares? I think it would not have gone very far. Same is true for Moltke. If we look at the changes in the 1850s, if Moltke and the group of persons around him had decided, well, this is a thing of the 1820s, really, and we don't need it anymore, it would probably have been dead by that. So I think it's it had these champions in the early decades of its existence, and by the 1870s, you have the situation that one of the questions I very often get asked very often is, does the Kriegspiel make the Prussian officers better than others? And there is no way to answer that. I mean, it's as a historian, I can't for the rest of my life even think about any methodological sound way of answering that question, because what's a good officer? And how to measure success, how to measure success in relation to something like the Kriegspiel, it's not possible to answer. But what you can say is the Prussians were convinced in the 1870s that Kriegspiel was an important tool for training, and everybody outside Prussia was convinced that Kriegspiel made, or wargaming, made officers better decision makers. So everybody was convinced of that. So by the 1870s, you don't need this champion any longer. But before that, you definitely need it. And and this is something actually where sometimes, let's say, make myself a nuisance because colleagues who see this differently. But I actually think that Müffling is more important to the history of the Kriegspiel than Reiswitz, its original inventor, because without Müffling, this thing would have gone nowhere. As I said, that's my personal sort of gut feeling. Wouldn't call it professional opinion. It's slightly too there's not enough evidence for a professional opinion, but it's my gut feeling that without a champion, it wouldn't have flowered in the Prussian army.
Thank you. Another question here from Tom Hames. There's a lot of talk kind of in war, especially when you lead into World War I, military studies about offense, defense balance, and the misunderstanding of that, and the misunderstanding of that occurred again in World War II. Tom asked, did the rules of Kriegspiel contribute to that misunderstanding of the nature of warfare that led into World War I?
Yeah. That is, again, a very interesting question. It is all the more so interesting because to some extent, this is discussion that in the 1870s, for example, there is some of it actually in the writings of Meckel. So there is discussion whether the Kriegspiel in its present form, as it's done in the 1870s, actually properly reflects the relationship between the offensive power of, say, infantry, for example, and the defensive power of say, infantry. And whether the Kriegspiel is actually basically giving an unjust advantage to well, the one who's on the offensive, which then would lead to the argument that the Kriegspiel possibly is one factor that had a role into skewing the perception of offensive versus defensive. The problem again is the evidence. There is no direct evidence tying any of the sort of dogmatical thinking of the Prussian or the German army, tying that directly to the Kriegspiel. So you don't have the evidence saying, we think this is going to happen because we have these results from our war games. This is simply not there. What we have is evidence that they think about, not only about how war games actually work, but also about whether they actually represent things properly. We have this evidence mostly from the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. And this evidence comes from the sort of dogmatical discussions at the time, which can be pretty wild. So there is a huge discussion in the 1870s, for example, of the merits, the relative merits of charging with the bayonet versus using your rifle to shoot at your enemy. And this actually spills over into discussions on the Kriegspiel. Meckel is someone who says charging with the bayonet against enemy infantry that is firing at you is pretty stupid. And there are others who say, yeah, well, it's going to cost you, but you're not going to win unless you actually enter close combat. And even as late as 1906, I mean, the later Marshal Foch of World War I fame, he wrote a large study on infantry combat. And he said, well, on the battlefield, there is this zone where there is no cover at all, where you face a hail of bullets, the pluie de balles. That is what you face, and there is no cover at all. And so the tactical problem is, I have this zone between me and the enemy, and there is no cover, and there are all these machine guns, rifles, etc., firing at me. And the tactical solution that is sort of offered by Foch is stick as closely together as possible. Get together as tightly as possible in your formation. Because only then the collective aggressive spirit will defeat the individual fear of getting killed. And psychologically, there is something to it. But effectively, it means that you are saturating the enemy with bodies. You are throwing people at them faster than they can kill these. And I mean, the rationale behind that was you have to get sorry, again, stilted 19th century language. You have to pick up the laurel of victory where it hangs, and it hangs on the tips of the bayonets of the enemy. So there is this belief that I have to attack, because only if I defeat my enemy in close combat, only then I will actually succeed. I can see that Kriegspiel is to some extent perhaps conducive to that, but then again, we have Kriegspiel practitioners saying, no, we have to change the rules because, you know, rifled guns are so deadly and the rules do not reflect that. There is another problem that sort of has something to do with this directly. And that is that Kriegspiel may, I mean, the problem with being very offensively minded is not only that you produce large numbers of casualties, but also that being offensively minded often has there's very little room for things going wrong. So you basically bet on most things actually working out you'd like them to work out. And one of the main problems of the Kriegspiel setup with facilitators is that the facilitators will always try to make a very good job. So you give me an order, and I will always try to, as a facilitator, to execute it in the best way possible. Because if I don't do that, you will accuse me of being incompetent or not impartial or something like that. So to some extent, what the Kriegspiel does is, if handled in a certain way, it can actually, let's say, give you the impression that things will work out in a way. And what you do not get is this feedback that, for example, a relentless offensive will tire out your troops, and then your decision-making process will be derailed because they won't communicate properly and things like that. You won't get this in a Kriegspiel because the facilitating team, they don't get tired, you know, because they can't afford to be tired, because they have to basically they have to make a perfect job. So the Kriegspiel in a way creates perfect subordinates, which in reality you don't have, and that may play into that as well. Sorry if I went on slightly on a tangent, but I think it's an important question. Fortunately, as I said, evidence is a problem.
Perfect. And one final question here from Michael. Can you speak briefly to von Verdi's Free Kriegspiel?
Yeah. Okay, so the Free Kriegspiel is, let's put it that way. So one of the problems that we nowadays have with the perception of what the Free Kriegspiel actually was lies with one of its main practitioners, a chap called Konstantin von Altrock, who in 1906, I believe, wrote a big study of the Kriegspiel, and he championed the Free Kriegspiel. And he claimed that basically everybody who is sane in his mind actually does it that way. And the sort of old way of doing the Kriegspiel, yeah, some old veterans in some clubs do this, but everybody who is really, you know, up to speed uses the free method, of which he was convinced. So the thing is, if you actually look beyond Altrock, you realize that even in the early 20th century, they still use dice. Now, the Free Kriegspiel was originally, if you look at what Verdi originally wrote, you'll find that the original idea was using the Kriegspiel in the way it was originally designed, had the danger of basically going down into the rabbit hole of deciding every single exchange of rifle fire by using dice. And this simply would then take very long and destroy one of the key advantages of the Kriegspiel, that you can, if facilitated properly, provide the participants with a real-life experience. But if every exchange of fire has to be resolved by using dice, this is not going to work. And this bogs things down extremely. And if you have a Kriegspiel where you actually take 7 hours to depict, let's say, 40 minutes of combat, then this quickly gets boring and destroys the experience. Now, the solution that Verdi originally came up with was not to abolish dice, because there are two levels of the problem he has is two levels really. One level is if I use dice too often to decide over the number of casualties created by infantry fire, then this all gets bogged down. But this is using dice in order to establish the number of casualties. What the Free Kriegspiel originally, what Verdi originally meant to use dice for was to infuse this element of chance. Because every now and then things on the battlefield happen, or rather, quite often things on the battlefield happen that are not quite what one would expect to happen. So you have an event, or you make a decision, and you have a likely outcome, and you have several not so likely outcomes. And the dice give you the opportunity for outcomes that are not so likely. Whereas if you have just the facilitator deciding what he deems plausible, you only ever have these plausible outcomes. Now, Altrock basically turned this around and said, yeah, this is what we want. We only, in an educational war game, want to teach the officers the plausible outcomes. We do not want to face them implausible outcomes or unlikely outcomes. But this narrows the Kriegspiel, the focus of the exercise, basically down to teaching you what is likely to happen. And this completely removes basically the problem of what do you do when things happen that are not likely. Also, the dice originally were meant to shield the facilitators from the participants. Now, just think of it as a social situation. You have a young lieutenant in the facilitating team, and his battalion commander is playing. And the young lieutenant then throws the dice, and yeah, down goes the plan of his battalion commander in flames. And afterwards, the battalion commander will say, yeah, I have a nice job cleaning the company or the battalion latrines for the next, whatever, 24 months or so. Then he can say, yeah, sorry, that's just, the dice, they were against you. So it has this element. And actually, a couple of years ago, here in Würzburg, we did an experiment. We had a dozen or so teams playing very small scenarios, just 3-person teams, 1 person blue, 1 person red, 1 person the facilitator. So we had about around 10 of these using dice and 10 using what deemed most likely to the facilitator. And it's very obvious. The obvious result is when you do not use dice for decisions, then it will always only that will happen that is actually the likely outcome. And you will never be faced by unlikely outcomes. And that is actually creates problems down the road. Now, the Free Kriegspiel, there is some literature out there that actually depicts the historic Kriegspiel as the Free Kriegspiel basically replacing the traditional Kriegspiel. That is patently wrong, because we can see that even as late as the 1910s, there are experiments with actually using very complex sets of tables and dice in order to determine casualties. And even the last set published in 1912, I think, that is a rehash of the Meckel set of rules for official use, includes dice, not for establishing casualties, but rather for introducing chance as an element. Okay, so let's turn from the Prussians to the 21st century. I think it's quite inducive to recap the main characteristics of a sort of traditional Prussian Kriegspiel. First of all, and that's very important, it's competitive. You have 2 parties that try to win. That may seem self-evident, but actually in many militaries around the globe, war games not rarely are actually scripted in one way or another. So either you have a fully scripted war game, or you have a, let's say, a red team that is basically guiding the blue team through the exercise. And at the end, they say, yeah, well, okay, so you have won, but only barely, or you have won, but brilliantly. But there is no room for bathing in the glory of seeing your opponent being kicked face down in the mud. That is mostly simply not done in military education nowadays. And Prussian Kriegspiel is exactly that. If you do it the way it was done in the 1860s, it's basically them or us, which includes facing failure and dealing with the fact that things go wrong. It is then, that's the second important point, a very powerful instrument for exposing participants to friction, to fog of war, and to the stress that this all causes. There is a very instructive phrase in German military phraseology, and that is the grundlegende Lageänderung, which means you have a plan, and there comes one point in the battle. If you're lucky, this point never comes, but usually there comes a point when you realize you have to make a major readjustment of your plan because something unexpected happens. That's the grundlegende Lageänderung, when the situation changes fundamentally. You cannot really train for that because you can't write a handbook that explains to you when there is a fundamental change of the situation, but you can expose participants to such a situation. You can push them into the situation where they have to decide, do I have to change my plan or not? Do I have to deviate from my plan, or is my plan still valid? So the Prussian Kriegspiel is very good at exposing participants to that. And third important point, it's extremely high accessibility. I mean, just to illustrate that, if we had the time and if I, as the facilitator, had done the preparation, we could start a Kriegspiel right now, in this very minute. All you have to know is the scenario, and assuming, I mean, in a military context, all everybody has to know is how to make military decisions. You are likely doing this with military decision makers, so they all know what they are doing. At least we hope so. And so it would be very easy to basically begin this with a very limited preparation. Also, as you do not have to know any rules, there is no ideal winning strategy. So it's not like a board game where you know, okay, if I do A, B, C, D, and let's say alpha, then this is the best way of actually winning. And if I do A, B, C, D, E, and miss alpha, then I already know, oh, I'm in trouble. This is not the case in Kriegspiel. It's simply an open exercise, and you have to try to find out what the enemy does. And the enemy may actually do very strange things, and then you have to react to that. So going by that, why is it still useful to look at the Kriegspiel? Now, first of all, making decisions under stress is always a good thing, or rather forcing participants to do this. More important, however, is to confront them with a situation where not all information that they want, or even all information that they need to make a good decision, is actually available. And this brings me to, I mean, we have been, my colleagues and I have been running these Kriegsspiele at the German Staff Academy since 2016 or 2017. So we have a little bit of experience in doing this with sort of, you know, mid-level decision makers. And we sometimes get funny feedback. Some of that is, so in the Prussian Kriegspiel, you do not always have contact with all your own units. So you not only have to do basically sketch out the red units, but you also have to do blue tracking, which can get pretty complicated if you in an age where you do not have radios, and where basically your communication is by a messenger who takes perhaps half an hour to your next unit, and then finds out that the unit that's supposed to be in village A is actually moved on towards village B or something like that. So some of the feedback we get is that the lack of permanent radio contact with your own unit, so always being able to see where your own unit is, or where your own forces are, this is totally unrealistic. And it's highly frustrating. And it's not the way things are done in our army. And yeah, I'll give you a C. Kriegspiel can be extremely frustrating. And many actually give us the feedback that it's not really fun. It's a very good learning experience, but it's not really fun. Or it can be, but it can also be extremely, you know, unfunny, to put it that way. But unrealistic? Nowadays we tend to think of, with the experience of nearly 20 years of asymmetric warfare, and with certain sort of images from floating around from more recent conflicts, we tend to think about the battlefield as being totally open. If we go back to the Cold War, one of the big Reforge exercises, Reforge in 1987, had the 1st Cavalry Division move around 5,000 vehicles through northern Germany in radio silence at night, because that was what they had to do. If you accept that you are going into a peer conflict, a peer-level conflict, and your peer has highly skilled personnel trained at intercepting and detecting radio emission, and this highly trained personnel sits in vans stuffed full with equipment that is worth millions of rubles. And outside these vans is a battalion full of tube artillery, trained to turn any command post they can identify in a huge parking lot. Then you're not going to keep radio contact with your forces at all time. Communication is, in a way, can be dangerous, and you should face the reality of not always being in contact with your forces. So that is actually important. Third important point is getting out of your comfort zone and facing, when it comes to the extremes, facing failure. Let me illustrate this with a very interesting and strange example. This is a map from the very last war game the Bavarian General Staff ran before the First World War. So the Bavarian General Staff takes up wargaming only in the 1890s. Each summer they run a huge war game that involves all of the Bavarian army, goes over several days. This is the last one run in June 1917. It's 6 weeks before the war breaks out. So if you want, war clouds are already on the horizon. And the Bavarian army, in the overall context of the First World War, has a very specific mission, and that is defending Alsace-Lorraine. And they train for that, and they run war games defending Alsace-Lorraine. But these big war games involving all of the army, run by the General Staff, they're different. The scenario here is, what you can see actually is a river. It's the Danube. And well, the scenario is in 1866, Prussians basically annex Franconia, and then they try to impose martial law and to recruit in North Franconia. And the Franconians stage an uprising, and the Prussians use this as a pretext in order to try to destroy and basically defeat Bavaria. And now the Bavarian army has to defend a sort of rump Bavaria south of the Danube against the Prussian army. But it's the Bavarian army of 1914. So this scenario is essentially the Bavarian army of 1914 defending Bavaria against the German army, against the rest of the German army, which is, I think you would agree, a little bit wild. It's something like, whatever, all the US Army units stationed in California defending California against all the rest of the US Army, something like that. Why do they do this? This is totally strange. And why do they do this with war already on the horizon? Well, by a stroke of luck, the chap sitting there is Rudolf von Xylander, who was the head facilitator. And by a stroke of luck, we have a sheaf of papers, his notes for the final post-mortem. And he also actually, in a post-war publication, explained why they did these things. It was to push participants totally out of their comfort zone. Yeah, we know that you know what to do in Alsace-Lorraine because we have trained this into you for the past 20 years. We know that you are capable of defeating a French assault into Alsace-Lorraine. And we know that you know all the little villages by heart. But what if something entirely different happens? Are you still up to your job when it's not about defending some village in Alsace-Lorraine, but about defending a village in near Ingolstadt or something like that? Actually, in 1912, not in 1914, in 1912, the Bavarian General Staff, the war game, the scenario was, well, so let's assume we do this attack into France thing. through Belgium. And let's assume it all goes bonkers and these Prussians lose. And let's assume the German army is basically in a rout, retreating behind the Rhine, pursued by French and British armies, and it's chaos. And let's assume Germany breaks up, and let's assume it's just us. We have to defend Bavaria against a French army that sort of goes into southern Germany. And let's assume, just for fun's sake, that Switzerland is siding with them. And Switzerland is preparing a navy on Lake Constance. And we have to defend against that as well. Welcome to the Bavarian General Staff war game of summer 1912. And again, this is wild. And the purpose is to push participants beyond the comfort zone. And if we look at the notes we have for this war game of 1914, a couple of these here. It's very funny. Xylander noted he made bullet points for this final discussion and said, some of these bullet points read, well, no premature retreat orders. Don't question your decision constantly. Don't collapse in the face of failure. Don't get distracted by every single negative report. No schematism. And I agree with you. That could be straight out of a military-themed fortune cookie factory. So there is no deep intrinsic theoretical value in this. But it's nonetheless very illuminating because it shows what this was all about. What if things go wrong? What are you going to do? You can't just leave the table in a real-life situation. You have to continue to make decisions, even if things go badly. You have to continue to make decisions. You have to try to turn it around, do things. And if you stop making decisions, the enemy will make all the decisions for you. And this is what this was, if you want, fundamentally about. At the end of the day, Kriegspiel is, as one of my British colleagues once called it, about outthinking the enemy. And this can be a very interesting experience, can be a very humiliating experience. And it also means Kriegspiel is about confronting your own bias. One of the stories I always like to tell is we once ran at the German Staff Academy small team Kriegsspiele, and I had a team of 3 Navy officers and a team of 3 Army officers fighting against each other. And these Army officers were very convinced that they were highly capable of doing this because there was a map. Yeah, everybody knows what a map is, and moving more forces on the map. Yeah, we all know about that. Sending reconnaissance elements out, perfect. The Navy officers were highly irritated by everything. So the map was not blue, and there was stuff on the map that was not floating and very difficult. And there was, chaps with pointy things and guns and, no buttons for sending effectors downrange. And so they were highly irritated. And they started to do all sorts of really wonky things. And I, as the facilitator, thought, oh my goodness, this is going to end so badly for them. And the Army team, they had sent out reconnaissance elements reporting all these strange things the Navy chaps were doing. And the Army officers, they looked at these reports and said, yeah, okay, so the facilitators obviously want to have a joke on us, or our reconnaissance elements are incompetent because no one in his sane mind would do this. This must be wrong. So in the time-honored spirit of I won't let my beautiful map be marred by the actual situation out there, they basically created a situational map of how they suppose the enemy must act. So this was this is the way the enemy must act, because if I were in the enemy's shoes, I would do this, and obviously then I know how to win. And the end result, you probably already imagined this, they lost, and badly. Basically, until I actually called it an end, the Navy chaps didn't know they were winning this. And then we had a discussion, and it was very interesting to see that the Army chaps said, well, this is not the way this is supposed to be. And this is not what you are going to do with your forces. You did all sorts of wrong things. You can't do that. And I very politely, because, we were training in that case, senior to middle to senior level military decision makers, so you have to be very polite. Just ask, well, do you really assume that the enemy is always doing things by your own book? What happens if he has a different book? What happens if he has thrown the book out of the window? So you actually have to be able to adapt mentally, intellectually to someone who may do very strange things. And this is what is meant by outthinking the enemy, really. At the end of the day, we come back to him. And one of the sort of most often mangled quotes is this one. No operational plan will likely stand beyond the first contact with the enemy force domain. It's important to realize he never said no plan survives contact with the enemy, because that is essentially nonsense. He meant no plan survives contact with, or rather survives identification of the enemy main force and the enemy intention. If you identify the enemy Schwerpunkt, then you have to plan anew, unless you, by chance, actually have identified that prior to the actual action, but that is pretty rare. So basically, what Kriegspiel is about, and what it's still very good at, is putting participants into possibly very uncomfortable situations where they have to make decisions and have to face uncertainty and failure. And I think that is today, in the second decade of the 21st century, as important as it was back in the sort of 1850s, 1860s, at the time of Moltke. Which brings this third part to a conclusion. And Walter again up to the front.
Wonderful. There's been a lot of energetic discussion of the Kriegspiel and kind of what the different participants are using it for. It actually is very interesting to see a lot of people heavily involved in the use of Kriegspiel to educate people at, Michael's talking about U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, using kind of, Gabriel is kind of talking about using 28mm tabletops to train senior enlisted men, which is very neat. Does anyone have any questions right now as it stands, or can we continue with the presentation? I will give people 30 seconds because I know typing takes a little bit. Right as I say we're moving on, it's going to pop up.
Yeah. So
okay, there we go. Tom says, can you speak to the adaptability of Kriegspiel to new forms of technology, especially today?
Yeah. So actually, that is probably the question we get asked most often. Can't we do this in the 21st century forces? Of course you can. And you can basically I would argue that the core concept of Kriegspiel is this, is that it's open, competitive, two or more parties really, and that is the setup of providing incomplete information and fog of war. And we have experimented with doing this online. We actually did a run with the Georgetown Wargamers, with a team from Würzburg and a team from Georgetown doing this online. There are chaps, I think, at the German Air Force trying to experiment with virtual reality and incorporating elements of that in Kriegspiel. So this would be one way of integrating modern technology. Obviously, the other sort of aspect of that question is depicting modern the modern warfare, the technology of modern warfare in these Kriegspiele, and that is basically easy if you have the sort of if you have the capability to develop a facilitating capability that retains this real-time aspect. The experience we have made is that what is crucial about this Kriegspiel setup is the real-time factor, that you actually sit in front of your map as a participant and actually get immersed in a way that you have the impression that there are actually things happening out there and you are slightly behind, and that operational tempo is actually important. and you really only get this when you have something that works more or less in real time. There is one thing though, and we have discussed this repeatedly with colleagues working in the German army. There is something to be said for not looking at present-day technology for certain purposes, and that is when you run a Kriegspiel, say for a mid-level decision makers, and you run this with a scenario, say from the Second World War, the First World War, the 19th century, something like that, then they will focus on decision making. What will not happen is that they will try to interact actually with the sort of simulative element. So there will be no discussion, yeah, but I know my tank better than you, the facilitator, and I know that my tank is actually going to shoot 20 meters further, and therefore your adjudicating was wrong. This is a problem that you actually run into when you deal with present-day technology, that you then may have to face criticism of the adjudication process based on the assumption that there may be a fault with the depiction of technology. Of course, the problem is running this as a decision-making exercise. In that context, it's really not about the technology. It's about how do you process information. How does your decision-making process work, and at which point is your decision-making process to go off the road?
The International Kriegspiel Society has been brought up in the chat, which is, Jorrit, I think you can actually speak a little bit to their work.
Well, actually, that would be, I would sort of leave the podium and, or rather, turn to Jan Heinemann, because he is from the Kriegspiel Society, and he can, I think, is far better qualified to talk about.
Oh, that's my mistake. I thought you were an affiliate. We can let Jan give a pitch briefly and return to Jorrit's presentation.
Yeah.
Because people seem to be interested in it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good idea.
Let me make him a co-presenter. Jan, you've been put on the spot. Very brief.
That's all right. Thanks a lot. Hello, everybody. So the International Kriegsspiel Society really came into being because of the pandemic, of course. Has grown now to over 2,000 members worldwide, and we are running a ton of different sort of formats of Kriegspiel, running original rules in real time, running sort of turn-based games if you want to play them for recreational purposes. That might be more convenient if you are working all week and then you can submit a turn every other day or so. And also experimenting with using the Kriegspiel approach, so to say, for crisis simulations of all sorts and kinds, which I think provides very interesting insights. And thanks to Mike, who has already posted the link in the chat, kriegspiel.org. Most of our work is via Discord, which allows for very, very neat sort of back-end regulations for the facilitators, but we also sometimes run the games via Zoom and other formats.
Perfect. Thank you, Jan.
Thanks.
Tom had a good insight here where the fog of war today reflects too much information rather than not enough. And that might, it certainly puts Kriegspiel in a different light where there's all this scarcity of information. Shall we continue, Jort, with the presentation?
Okay, so the last bit is pretty short, but as I said, now comes the commercial. I just wanted to highlight a little bit the stuff that we do at Würzburg. So obviously, we do this 1867, the original Prussian Kriegsspiel. We have done this, and this is the thing that we usually use when in sort of for training purposes with the German army. It's really a reconstruction of the Prussian original. It's based on the 1867 edition of Chischwitz, this Anleitung zum Kriegsspiel. It's just I brought you a this is the sort of main facilitator table. We always use an 1867 map of the Königreich's battlefield, and usually have Prussians against Austrians or Saxons, and all sorts of strange things happen. What is really nice about the setup is that you can actually have different levels of the chain of command in teams when you do it with large numbers of participants. So we do this regularly with 10 to 20 participants on each side, so 20 to 40 participants in all, which means that you have then the possibility of, say, 3 divisions and a core command team trying to control them. And this creates a lot of friction, and the one sort of limiting factor is that you need a fairly large number of assistant facilitators for coordinating all the messages going to and fro between the participant teams, which in general is one of the limiting factors when it comes to the scalability of the Kriegspiel, the facilitating team. You really need 2 head facilitators actually discussing what happens on the map, and then the larger the number of participants, the larger the number of assistant facilitators you need, who are actually writing down messages and carrying the messages to the participants. Yeah, and this is the sort of map in some more detail. This is actually near the end of that game, and red has, so we have turned history around. The Austrians and the Saxons actually decisively defeated the Prussians in that game. The second thing we do is the Meckel game. The key invention of Meckel was, apart from its theoretical things, was that he introduced these 3 different levels of tactical, operational, and strategic wargame. And this is actually something that we have in common with the Kriegspiel Society. We developed this basically immediately before COVID, and then when we started to try it out, it was under COVID constraints, so a lot of it was actually done online. Again, in training situations. We use as a setting, we used the Meckel Kriegspiel, used the opportunity to have a different setting, not the original sort of Prussian one. We use French invasion of England always as a setting. This is, if you want, a sort of bow to the beginning of wargaming in the British world, in the Anglophone world. The very first British wargames had these settings and these scenarios, and this is basically what we use. We have a tactical, it's called Doom of Eastbourne, where you have French forces trying to envelop and essentially basically force their way into a defended city. This is something we have done with in cooperation with Georgetown, the Georgetown Wargamers last year, and an experience we hopefully will be able to repeat one day. Then we have done are still doing these Sussex Sorrows simulations or war games. This is actually done over 3 days, or rather over 3 weekends. So you have this is on a map of about 10 by 70 kilometers. And it's operational in nature. It has a logistical tail, has casualty management, has civil military interaction. So it is complex beyond the sort of kinetic aspect of warfare. And then we have the sort of strategic, in the Prussian sense, strategic level. It's basically a campaign, so a French campaign against, with the attempting to actually capture London and so defeat Britain. We did this in April 2020. It's actually, it was a 12-day real-time or near real-time staff exercise, and my strong advice would be, don't do this. Doing something for over 12 days, 12 continuous days, and particularly this included elements like policy, a political element. We had news reporters writing stuff and things like that. So it was 12 days of continuously working and little to no sleep, and it was pretty stressful for both the participants and the facilitators. It was very interesting, but I think the operational level is probably the more suited to everyday use, to put it that way. Now, and then we have our gamified Kriegspiel. Now the thing is, and this I already told you that at the very beginning. One of the problems of the Kriegspiel is the facilitating team. It limits the scalability. So in theory, I could do a Kriegspiel with 150 participants, but then I'd need whatever 30 assistant facilitators or something like that, which is a problem. And you always get the problem, you don't get around the problem that the facilitating team will always try to do its best. You will not have subordinates stalling your orders. But in reality, this happens. In 1914, when the Russians attack East Prussia, the Germans have a plan. The plan includes retreating from the border to a defensive line in the sort of hinterland of East Prussia. And there is a corps commanding officer of an army corps called von Francois, and he says, no, this plan is bonkers. I don't do this. No, I want to defeat the Russians at the border. So instead of moving backwards, he actually moves to the border. And what's more, because he's clever and he thinks his basically his army commander is clever as well, he takes his radio telegraph team and sends it back to Insterburg, 40 kilometers behind his own HQ, so that when the army HQ tries to find him by actually sort of, locating his radio emissions, they'll find, yeah, okay, his radio telegraph team is in Insterburg, so his HQ will be there. So he has actually pulled back his forces as he was supposed to do. But in fact, he didn't. He actively tried to deceive his army commander, thereby derailing the whole plan. You cannot replicate this in a facilitating team. That's simply impossible, because then the participants would say, yeah, well, that's what I'm going to do. This is not the way a facilitating team should work. In order to overcome this and to have scalability, what we did was inventing Plié de Balle, which is basically a very simple set of tabletop wargaming rules. And then you have at least 2 rooms with pretty large maps. What you can see here is a very large map, 3.50 by 4 meters. And you divide up the participants in staff teams and actual force commanders. And the force commanders crawl around these maps and have to move around tokens according to very simple tabletop rules. They only have 2 minutes for their turns. They are totally sort of overtasked with what they have to do, because sort of what you can see, there are around about 1,200 tokens in all. We depict army corps to army level combat, and the tokens depict companies and individual guns. So you basically have 40,000 Frenchmen with hundreds, well, not hundreds, 150 guns, and the tokens depict individual companies of 100 men and individual guns. So there is a huge amount of stuff that you have to actually move around, and you have 2-minute turns, and then your opponent has 2 minutes, then you have 2 minutes, and we don't make a lunch break. So it's usually 8 hours in 2-minute turns, kneeling on the map, which is actually physically stressful. This is physically demanding, and it results in the chaps actually moving the tokens on the map. They also have to write the reports on which the staff teams sitting in these nice cozy staff rooms have to make the decisions. So the longer this takes, and we usually have this run over 2 days, the longer this takes, the more stressed out the force commanders are, and the more the quality of the reports actually deteriorates. And these force commanders are actually humans. So when an order comes from the staff team that they don't understand, they are not sitting around asking their fellow main facilitator, I don't understand this, what do you think they mean? They just say, well, I don't understand it. They write back a report. Please send me an order that I understand. Or they simply ignore their order, as von Francois did. So they react in a, you have the human factor that actually enters into all this. This makes it extremely sort of capable in not only depicting fog of war and friction, but also into transferring the frustration of the staff teams to their force commanders and vice versa. And then it's a very interesting team experience, if you want. And this is something, obviously, you can't have senior leadership crawling around for 8 hours on a map. This is something we do with officer candidates and young officers. And it's usually the feedback we get from the force commanders is something like, my back hurts, my knee hurts, this is hell, when can we do it again? And the feedback of the staff teams is, well, I volunteered for being in the staff because I thought it's all plushy, and I barely couldn't cope with the psychological stress of sitting in this room and having to make decisions that actually affect my friends in that other room on the map, and I don't have all the information available. So it's all around a very, very interesting experience for everybody around. Now, one final thing, sort of our guiding principles, and the reason everybody in the end wants to, well, not kill the facilitator, but at least those doing the scenarios. So we believe in real-time stuff and in that it's always open. So you have to try to outthink your opponent. I absolutely don't believe in symmetry. One feedback we routinely get at the staff academy is, well, the scenario wasn't really fair. Yeah, fairness. I don't believe in that. If you are on the battlefield in a situation where there is fairness, then someone higher up in the chain of command, pardon me for saying it, fucked up majorly, because you do not want to be in a situation where there is fairness. So the scenarios we usually have is I give out any kind of objectives that you really can only fulfill when you are very creative with your units. So you have, let's say, half the strength of your opponent, but your mission is actually to attack your opponent, things like that, to delay him or something like that. So it's we also strongly believe in that you simply have to make do with the situation at hand. Also, and that's the third point, and that's the most important point, really, particularly when it comes to doing this in an educational context. And perhaps I should say that we don't do a lot of recreational wargaming, mainly because the wargames we do, particularly the sort of plié-de-balle thing, of course, there are those with a sort of sociopathic glee or desire for doing something like that, but usually this is not really fun. It's a very valuable training experience, and one they usually engage happily in it. But I'm not sure whether it actually works works recreationally. But when it comes to educational war games, the most important thing for us is this thing about failure, that you actually realize things can go wrong, and then I have to deal with it. I can't just leave the table and do nothing. And it's not that the facilitators or the umpires in the case of plié-de-balle, they will not stop the simulation to make a magic move or to let you redo something that you did wrong. No, if you have spent 4 hours moving your forces up to that river you have to cross, and accidentally you left your pontoons at the starting line. Yeah, well, so find a solution, or spend another 4 hours getting the pontoons up to the river. You need them. I'm not going to help you. The thing is, Phil Sabin, one of the most important persons still in wargaming, I think, once said that in war games there are no losers, there are only learners. And the point behind that really is that wargaming is the only thing that you can really lose in wargaming, apart from your composure, and made quite a lot of experience in this with participants, is perhaps your sort of your professional pride, because things can go wrong. But no one's going to die. Nothing is going to get broken, other than dice that someone throws at the wall in frustration. Nothing serious happens. So you only get a very, very small impression of what it's like when things go wrong. In war, I mean, that's pure Clausewitz. In war, things will invariably go wrong, and you have to face that and realize, okay, things go wrong, but I have to function, continue to function as a decision maker. I have to continue to actually make decisions, because if I don't make the decisions, my opponent will make my decisions for me, and you don't want that. So that's us. That's the end of my commercial. And any questions?
Jörg, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. You pretty ably answered every question that this group of gentlemen here and women have put forward. And so I thank you for that, and I thank you for making the time. Does anyone else have a question for Professor Winches here? When you're talking about, I had a question, and this may be, what is the most radical variation on a Kriegspiel that you've seen in your study of them? Maybe something from far back in history, but something that has completely shaken up the idea of a Kriegspiel to, it doesn't even have to work, right? You know, if it proved unsuccessful, that's still interesting to me.
Yeah.
This is a format that's been around for a long time.
Yeah. I think actually the most radical thing in Kriegspiel history that I have seen so far is actually this sort of operational leader course done by the fledgling German Air Force in 1916, because because of the indiscriminate use of the term Kriegspiel. So the whole course is called Kriegspiel. They use the term Kriegspiel for the writing assignments, which basically are you get a scenario and have to write up the initial orders and the logistics, and they use it for an adjudicated war game at the end. And somehow I've so far not been able to actually find out whether this way of using the terminology had an impact on the actual practice and whether that was continued afterwards. One of the big problems of Kriegspiel research is that war games usually they leave a paper trail, but very often it's the paper trail that, I mean, I showed you this table in from last week when we did this war game with the Planungsamt of the Bundeswehr. Nearly all of the material, so all of the orders, reports, and the scenario material, this was all binned afterwards, because that's what usually happens with writing material. So very often you don't get the actual material in the archival evidence, and I haven't been able to find out whether this really strange use of Kriegspiel then became, you know, regular practice, or whether it even had an impact on the understanding of practice. I think that's, historically speaking, the sort of wildest thing I have seen. Outside the sort of historical stuff, the wildest experience I have made is with really decisions the participants make. I mean, the thing is, if you run an open simulation, an open war game, and if you run it on an operational level, that includes logistics, casualties, POWs, and civilians, then participants can make all sorts of decisions. And I have seen all sorts of really, really weird decisions requiring the facilitating team then to basically be on its toes and react to that. So stuff like interacting with civilians in ways that would be described as creatively improper, or interacting with POWs in the same way. And then, of course, this requires the facilitating team to go into overdrive. If you say at the very beginning, you can decide what you want, it's likely that the participant will at some point do that. And this can recreate some really wild stories.
Thank you. Thank you. A couple more questions, one from Jan and one from Tom, which I'm going to merge into one question because they're kind of adjacent to it. What's your advice for new umpires? And what are your thoughts on using Kriegspiel more analytically as opposed to educationally?
Yeah. So my advice for new umpires would be, don't make the mistake I made in the beginning, or we made in the beginning, my colleagues and I, and that was waiting too long to actually simply try it out. So we tried to understand Kriegspiel by looking at the rules, and this is not going to work because you are only going to understand it if you actually set it up and then try to get it underway, and try this as early as possible. Of course, one has to get the rules, read the rules, and then try to get into running it as soon as possible. Also, don't get bogged down too much with detailed rules. The thing is, if you take any of these original Prussian rules, they provide quite a lot of detail with certain things. For example, bizarre example, you fire at a village with artillery, and then, well, the village starts to burn. There is actually a mechanism using dice in order to determine how the fire spreads. Don't use that. We once actually tried this, and it simply sort of destroys the whole experience. So the way we actually came to the point where we are now was after some initial sort of experiments with trying to be as closely to the rules as possible, and this didn't work out fairly well. We said, okay, we'll go a different way. We try to run it and use only the most basic rules so that the participants have a good experience. And then, gathering experience in facilitating it, we sort of build on the very basic rules and take in more rules as we go. Always keeping in mind, we should try to provide this real-time experience. But the most important advice really is just try it out. Try it out and make your own experience. Don't be intimidated, and don't look too long at the rules, because at the end of the day, they are only there to help the facilitators. The other thing about the analytical use is I have to admit, I'm slightly skeptical about the sort of value, because the main problem is the participants will always bring their own bias to, if you want, the war game. Now, if you want to use it to find out how well participants can react to all sorts of strange things that happens, Kriegspiel excels at that. If you want to use the Kriegspiel in order to find out how, for example, I know I have an enemy and I want to see how my own planning fares against that enemy, then this would require that your facilitating team knows a hell of a lot about how this enemy actually operates. And I think there are there is better methodology in red teaming about that than in Kriegspiel. Of course, you can sort of combine the two, but I think the I would say I would be a little bit careful when it comes to the analytical use of Kriegspiel. I mean, I have to, full disclosure, I'm generally, I wouldn't say skeptical, that's pushing it too hard, but I'm not not totally sold to the idea of wargaming being a very good analytical tool. It can certainly be used for that. It can be used for generating data, but I think that's not what wargaming in general excels at, put it that way.
I would agree with you, and I think there's other people in this call even who might look at the kind of growing trend of wargaming and the over-prescription of wargaming as this tool, that there's something maybe to be scared of there, and that, you know, this is something that has its uses, but that we should not market as snake oil, you know, for people trying to, you know, exactly. So your fears on that are my reservations as well. Another question comes from Tom here, who would ask, what would you suggest as guidelines for scenario design if you're an umpire?
Yeah. So that really depends on, and I hope no one of my colleagues actually listens to this. This really depends on what is the main purpose of your war game. So if you want to run a more or less recreational Kriegspiel, then I would actually suggest some sort of balancing. Whereas if it's really for an educational purpose, then the question is, what is the main sort of educational aim of the war game? So in the games we run, we usually try to basically give every side enough to be engaged and put enough imbalance. I mean, we always tell everybody that this will be totally balanced and both sides will have so we basically lie to the participants constantly, which is one of the great puns of being a facilitator. But I would, I mean, if you start with small groups and sort of small scenarios, and for recreational things, it should be designed in a way that both sides have a decent chance to actually fulfill their mission, which is something we routinely don't do in educational context. We often have scenarios where both sides either have a mission that has nothing to do with the reality, or have missions that are very difficult to actually achieve because it's not about actually achieving the mission. It's not about standing on the victory hex at the very end. It's always about what actually happened, how did you decide, what was your process, and perhaps the one important thing that is the same in educational and that I would argue should be the same in educational and recreational Kriegspiel is always have in mind that what you are depicting is part of bigger events. Always have the context in mind. So try to motivate the scenario out of a certain context, and at the end of the day, decide who has actually won by looking at what will happen in 4 hours, in 4 days, in 4 weeks. So how does the outcome affect this overall context? Other than that, I would say I can't be more specific because that would depend on the sort of specific, you know, period that you're going to war game, on the sides you're choosing, something like that. Of course, if you are, just as a small plug, if you are interested in wargaming with a heavy focus on late 19th century English invasion angst, then go to our webpage where we have quite a number of sort of scenarios that we have run in the past that are discussed there.
I had one final question. We hear a lot about Kriegspiel, and we hear about it kind of being adapted to modern use, and we hear a lot, of course, about the 19th century in Kriegspiel. Does Kriegspiel work well when formatted to the older eras of warfare? Is there enough maneuver and enough variety in these older eras of warfare? And have you seen it done where you could run sort of a Kriegspiel based off of say,
Yeah.
one of the Crusades, or like even further back into antiquity?
Yeah, we have done this with sort of the setup with antiquity. I think here the sort of, well, it's not really a trick. The problem is on a tactical level, you come to a point where it really, you, for example, take the Roman army on a tactical level. It's so small and so interconnected that the Kriegspiel really doesn't properly work. But on an operational or sort of grand operational level, there is basically no difference. It's for example, if you say, as I said, the Crusades, running a crusade as a Kriegspiel would be, or the sort of part of crusade once they sort of enter the Levant, as a Kriegspiel, combining logistics as a sort of grand operational, or in the Prussian terminology, a strategic Kriegspiel, with logistics and a warfare element, obviously, would be no problem at all. We have done similar things in Roman imperial context.
Perfect. Professor Winches, thank you for your time. And that concludes the seminar. Take care, everyone. I'm just hearing now about a Warhammer Kriegspiel that someone has played, which sounds sick. It's like very jealous. But yes, take it easy, everyone, and thank you for coming. Bye-bye.
Oh, thank you for having me.
All right. Take care.